Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, an inspired conversation space between Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner on the journey of motherhood through the common thread of parenting, relationship, and sexuality as a path to consciousness.
We keep our conversations honest, our experiences real, and our philosophies exploratory. We believe that in order to raise incredible humans, we first have to raise ourselves. We know that in order to rock the family, you've got to nourish the mother. If you are here, you care about paving a path of conscious and intentional motherhood, connected with yourself and your gifts, and also illuminating your children in theirs so we may raise more whole humans who can impact this world in a more humane way.
If you desire to integrate your learnings practically and supportively, head on over to bridgetwood.life or julietenner.love to go deeper. And for all live-streamed pre-release podcasts and all our free content, head over to our free Facebook group, Nourishing the Mother with Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner. We are Julie Tenner and Bridget Wood, and we are so grateful you're here.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood, and today we have not Julie Tenner, but Meg Berryman on the podcast, which I'm really thrilled about. So we're going to be having a conversation all around radical compassion during these times of changing world. And I think it's off the back of our podcast the last 2 weeks around lockdowns. To move into this space with such an amazing woman feels really rich for me right now. And I really hope that this is a conversation that deeply nourishes you too, our listener. So welcome, Meg.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and for us to have a conversation. It's been a little while, so it'll be just nice to catch up as well and see where we land.
So we're also live streaming this podcast right now into a Facebook group. So if you want to catch the live streams, you can join that group. It's called Nourishing the Mother with Bridget Wood and Julie Tenner on Facebook. So if you want to catch live streams, hop in there. Now, Meg Berryman is a trauma-informed coach, yoga teacher, and consultant, seeding and teaching regenerative ways to live, lead, learn, and do business. She centers embodiment, connection, and sustainability in her family, relationships, and offerings, celebrating the small, the simple, and the slow in everything she does. She lives on and is regenerating a small farmlet on Jawarang land in central Victoria, Australia, with her 2 wildlings, her partner in business and life, Dave, and a whole host of animal friends. It just feels good to read. And I was thinking, when I introduce you, I have to say, reading your words and being in your spaces feels like such a blessing to my nervous system. Like, it just feels like this gentle cloak of, I don't know, softness and acceptance. And I think that that's what so many people need right now, particularly those who are listening in Australia, maybe in New South Wales or Victoria, who feel like they're ricocheting off the walls with what's going on. And so, I would love to hear your perspective, your thoughts, what's moving through you right now, Meg.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for sharing that, because I think that as an embodied leader, I guess embodying compassion and groundedness and acceptance and inclusion is something that I've worked really hard to do. Like to adopt that posture in my life and in my spaces. So it's really nice to hear that that's what you feel, because it's very intentional, I think. And also, of course, the medicine that I've most needed in my life, that absolute radical, unconditional acceptance, validation of how I'm feeling. So, how am I feeling and what's moving? It's a funny time. I said before we went live that I'm noticing how much more attention my self-care needs. And at the same time, within that, I'm acutely aware of the absence of collective care right now, and why I'm feeling like there's so much more on me to have to get myself to be functional. Because I think that what's happening is that over the last 18 months, there's been an experience of holding and waiting and just gritting through this. And I think what I'm noticing and sensing and feeling in myself and the collective is there's almost a turning of the wheel towards an acknowledgement that life isn't going to be the same, and that instead of just gritting and holding in the absence of a collective model of care, it's not sustainable, you know, that we actually can't carry all of that on our own in our bodies, in our families. And so where I'm moving to is starting to, towards the latter half of this year, stop waiting and starting to feel into what would life feel like if this was the normal, if this was the new normal for me and my family. And what supports and resources would I need to put in place? How would I need to reorient my work? How would I need to shift in terms of living much more locally, for example? My family's an hour and a half away in Melbourne. I've seen them twice this year. You know, what would that look like? And when I do that from a place of absolute validation and acceptance of how I'm feeling, so I'm not gaslighting myself and saying I shouldn't be feeling this because everyone else has it harder, because I'm in regional Victoria and everyone's in, you know, has it worse. When I absolutely just validate and include what is actually experienced in my body. So whether I think it should be there or not, I'm experiencing.
It's still there.
It's still there. I'm still having that experience. It gives me just a breath and a tiny opening to start to have that conversation, a tiny bit of bandwidth to start to have that conversation about, well, if this is going to be life for the foreseeable future, how do I want that to look, so that I'm feeling that there's a little more choice and agency within the confines of the structures and the hierarchies that we've built and organised life around. Are you feeling that too?
Yeah,
shift. Yeah,
and I was playing with this. You know, what if this is like, what if we're here next year? Like, what if it's the same next year that we're here again? How could I live or even thrive in that? And what would need to change to facilitate that, either in my mindset or the way that I've structured my life, as you say, and what I need to feel resourced, because the pain comes from the attachment to getting out of this.
100%.
Or the attachment to going back to normal. And it's that comparison and that judgment that this is wrong that is causing for so many of us. I mean, setting aside those who are having extreme challenges right now, whether that's ability to feed themselves or, you know, being in extreme tense situations domestically or beyond. But for those of us who have a base level of support, I think it's continuing to come back into how could I find ease here, or how could I work with this and not resist it?
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that, because what I'm noticing is there's a lot of tools and practices that, like, folks in our communities, for example, have. And then there's a point, and we've all got a threshold, right, at which point we feel like the feelings that we're experiencing make us not lovable. And at that exact threshold moment is when we're going to project out, you know, into the collective.
Yeah.
And what I'm noticing is that started happening, right? And it's not anyone's fault. I have so much compassion. I'm doing it too, right? That we're hitting the edge of the experience we're having in our body and what we can hold. And we're hitting the limit of what we believe others can hold for us or with us or alongside us.
Yeah.
And that to me is an enormous invitation. So I feel like, for example, over the last 18 months, there's been a whisper within me about, am I living according to the principle that I teach around local living, right? Because to me, the way out of most of the crises that we're talking about, economically, climate, socially, has to be in building local, thriving communities and economies. It's the only way forward.
Because that's where resiliency lives.
100%.
Yeah.
And to do that, what we're going to have to do is stop identifying as purely global beings that have an identity wrapped around our work or how good a parent we are, or, you know, or our wealth, material wealth, right? We're going to have to stop identifying so much around those things, which is where so much suffering is coming from right now, because we don't have the capacity to perform as that industrial, technological, global being, productive being, right, in a capitalist.
And an example of that is, you know, the mother who's trying to perform a job and raise children at the same time, and realizing that those are not identities or practices that one human can do effectively. So it's like a collision of ideologies, I suppose.
And there's dissonance because we've been so conditioned to follow this role, this path in life, to be good at this thing that we do, or to identify as this thing that we are. But you look in the not so distant past, we identified as in relationship. It was all relational. It was, I'm this person's sister, I'm this person's mother, I'm this person's neighbor, I'm this person's auntie, I play this function in the community, which is not a job, it's a way of being.
Yes.
Right? It's not a job, it's not a vocation. It's like that person knows the wisdom of the trees. You know, that's not a job, it's who they are. It's the gifts that they were given. So we also identified as place. We were very place-based. We identified as where we lived. We identified with the natural world around us. We were mapping and tracking the seasons according to where we lived, right? It's not to romanticize it or anything. It's just to say that that's 40 billion years of evolutionary adaptation. That's how we evolved as human beings. And so now we're at this crisis point where the model that we've been taught, which is that to feel good about ourselves, we need to be good, productive, industrial beings. And for women, we also need to be exceptional mothers, as you say, and carers, and be in service to others. We can't sustain that because the collective care doesn't exist. And so there's this enormous crisis of, it's actually an identity crisis. And we're getting so agitated because the things that we've attached to keep us safe from the fears that we're not lovable, or the fears we'll be outcast, or fears we'll be rejected, those things that keep us safe from that, we can't perform. And so to me, the only way forward is to stop identifying with those things so much, because it's just creating so much suffering, and to be like, well, my capacity is not there, so how else can I identify to feel good at the end of the day that I'm enough? And to me, that's like, am I putting enough meals on? Like, am I just, is everyone fed? You know, that's the baseline. Am I fed? Have I been outside today? Have I given or received a phone call? And it's not about like fostering collective care as terms of like it's a tit for tat thing. It's about, do I feel that there is a web of relationship around me, that there is that there is resources being reciprocally exchanged, you know? And that's my baseline. And right now, that's enough. And we can talk more about all the other things going on in the world and what that brings up. But like, for you, like, could that be enough in a day for you right now? How does that land with you?
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking like this is like radical self-compassion around the reality that you find yourself in, but also like radical self-responsibility around the identities that you try to wrestle yourself into or not right now. Because so much of that pain, and I think also the division that we see, is simply us bumping into ourselves and what we're trying to reconcile. And so what we have not or cannot right now integrate we are facing head on.
Yeah.
And it's all mirrors for where that edge is, for where that judgment is, for where that comparison is, for where that denial is. Right. And like that feels really brutal.
It's brutal because it's also everyone else is having that experience. So what's happening is all the places when we start to get activated or we start to feel that edge of shame or that edge of like overwhelm, we will run toward the things that we've been patterned from a very, very young kid to run towards that gives us a dopamine fit or a feeling of safety. And what's happening is we're trying to run toward those things to save us because we're legitimately and really understandably feeling overwhelmed by the situation.
Yeah.
We're running towards those things and we run into someone who's just as activated as us and we can't fall into them and we can't project onto them because they've got no fucking bandwidth either.
Yeah.
And we can't run towards work because our bodies are like, no, I cannot, I just cannot. Or we're running towards, like 2020, I was drinking much more than I would have liked to have been. And it wasn't excessive, but it was that grey area drinking of like, we're running towards those things or comfort eating. And 2021 for me has been like, my body's like a no to that. I couldn't keep running towards those things. And so what we're left with is the relationships that are deep enough to hold us where there's this tiny amount of bandwidth between us. So we've got a relationship, you and I, for example. I went through a really big experience this year. And between the two of us, I had none, but you maybe had a little bit in that moment. And then we've oscillated, throughout the year.
Yeah.
We both had big things going this year. So it's like we can never generate the bandwidth ourselves necessarily, as the capitalist model would tell us as individuals. We're going to have to start negotiating this differently. And that's scary when this is all we've known. And when we've attached and invested so much of ourselves into constructing the identity and the ways of belonging that keep us safe, but ultimately don't super nourish us either. It's confronting. It's very
It also speaks a little to that journey from the head to the heart as well. Like, our head has created these silos and these boxes and these ways of being that we need to fit into, that we've come to know and come to feel safe in. But it's like our hearts are calling us deeper. Yeah. Like, how much can you dismantle of all that you think things need to be, or the world has to be, or people need to be, to find greater love and awareness? And that's that tussle, as well as how much can I like let life flow through this space in me, as opposed to letting my head wrestle, get in the way and go, no, it can't be like that, no, it should be like this, and you can't do that to me, or you can't say that to me, or you have to do this, or how dare you, like all of that like narrative. But it's like, okay, like the world is coming to you. You are meeting yourself here. Like, how much can you open your heart to that?
Yeah. And that's so beautiful, and something I teach and try and practice messily, of course. I say this all the time, that in an ecosystem, in the natural world, if we're looking there for wisdom, of which there is much because we are it, ecosystems are always adapting based on feedback. So there's too much of one predator, there'll be more of the prey, or vice versa, or there's not enough mycelium, like a fungus in the soil, to carry nitrogen nutrients to different plants, so it will up that. Like, it's this homeostatic flux, always trying to find homeostasis, but it modulates. It's not like this. It's not linear growth, right? Like we've been taught, it's not linear. Micro adjustments, it's how I live my life, micro tweaks. And if you think about that, the most important thing I think right now, the piece that we're missing because we haven't been taught how to do it, is that we can acknowledge the feedback without making it mean anything that we're doing wrong. Because when you start to live in the way that you can see both the self and the system and the interplay between the two, it's not your fault that you're struggling right now. It's not your fault that even though you have safety net and privilege, this feels really fucking hard. It's not your fault that you're getting agitated at people and projecting. So it's not, right? And at the same time, can you let the feedback be there in the body and have that humble bathroom floor moment of saying, this is just not working, without then piling on the conditioned woman way of being, which is to say, that means I'm there's something wrong with me, right? That means I must be wrong. Because if we can do that, it opens up, like I said at the start, a breath of possibility and creativity and resourcefulness. And it actually allows us to start to adapt based on feedback as opposed to locking down or doubling down.
Yeah.
Which is the way we've been taught. And I love what you said about life finding its way, because I had this beautiful reframe by an amazing trauma-informed yoga teacher called Maylai Swan. She's the director of Yoga for Humankind, and I was running a webinar series this week with her, and she said, you know, as women, we've been conditioned to be in service to others. But she said, what if the reframe was you're in service to something, and therefore whatever you're in service to, you need to embody and have the medicine of first. And so for me, I'm in service of life, and life wants us to survive, and life wants us to adapt, and life wants us to come back into community, and life wants us to figure out more sustainable ways of being, because that is what life is speaking through us all the time, trying to find these ways. And the capitalist model is like lockdown, feel ashamed, you don't fit, this is like, it's your fault. And I'm like, what if we could relax that secondary part and just be like, this is really hard, I'm having a lot of compassion for that, there must be another way. And what would be the body posture of that more creative, conversational, curious place that we could come from instead of the survival place? Because the truth of it is that you belong to life. And even though acknowledging these big things about what's not working might feel like the ground on which you sit is starting to shake, you still belong somewhere. You still belong to life. You still belong and are lovable. Whether you're an exceptional thing in your career or an exceptional mother or, you know, all these things you could do pre-pandemic, you're still lovable. And so there's not so much pressure to like perform that role. You know what I mean?
I really hear too, it's so much of a stripping back.
Yeah.
In order to have the foundations through which to allow life to shape you, like to allow you to move and adapt the way that life is asking you to move and adapt right now.
Yeah.
And that, you know, considering that the stress response in us is activated at that point in which we're struggling with that adaptation.
Yes, that's such a beautiful way to frame it. And I was just thinking, like, it's so worthwhile acknowledging my business has decreased in income. I can't take on as many clients anymore. My mothering is certainly not where it was 2 years ago. Like, my body is not where it was 2 years ago. My relationships, some of them have really suffered. Like, it's not to say that thriving is keeping everything how it was.
Yeah, like thriving ducks in a row.
No, thriving to me is adaptation. If you think about like a being, like a living being on the savannah that just stays still in a freeze is going to get eaten. Like, our adaptive capacity is actually where our resilience is built. And the most, I mean, it sounds like I'm gaslighting and I'm not, or bypassing, because it's all acknowledging all of that. But to me, the exciting conversation here is like, what if we listen to those whispers of life moving through us? What might it move us towards? And there's going to be some messiness, because like, for example, in my business decreasing compared to what it was last year, yeah, like we're in more debt than we were. It doesn't make me a bad person.
Yeah.
It's not the end of the world. Like, I'm still okay.
How can you love that? I also, you know, play with too this idea of, you know, of what's breaking down, what part of me wanted that to break down. Because life is always creating and destroying. And we want to attach to the creation all of the time, and the, you know, the shininess and the production and the what we see. But to have room for that, there has to be some decay or some destruction. And so if we see that in nature, and we know that to be true in nature, then that must also be true in ourselves and in our lives. And so what part of what we're being asked to let go of are we willing to let go of?
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that about nature, because I think that, like, in nature there's no waste. So another concept that I hear a lot is, like, if I acknowledge the feedback, and the feedback is telling me that actually I want my hands in the soil, what happens to the, like, in my case, 9 years I spent at university and 15 years I spent building a career, you know, what happens to that? And it's like, what's the purpose of life? You know, like, what are we here to do? Are we here to experience? Are we here to be in relationship? Are we here to attain a very narrow construct of success that we've been taught equals validation and love as a human being and acceptance, you know? And that's called confronting, like, mortality, like these conversations with mortality, they're confronting, but it's liberatory to me to instead of gripping tighter to the identities, to start to soften and be like, what's being composted, and could I not see it as a waste, but could I see it as just compost toward my next becoming, and which is intrinsically tied to our becoming. Because what we're seeing now in so many facets of life is that my well-being cannot come on the back of yours or someone that has grown up in a historically disadvantaged community. Like, that doesn't work anymore. It's not a zero-sum game. It doesn't work. And so we're going to have to decide, because I've had a lot of clients I work with and they're like, I want the regeneration and I want to regenerate this. I want to slow down, but I also want to earn this amount, and I also want to, like, have this family, and I also want to, and I believed that for a really long time. And it's not to, like, poo-poo that or anything, but it's, if you want that, but it's to say, do you really want that? Like, do you really, or is there a way of being that you're yearning for and craving that is going to come as we release our grip on these things that we think are going to make us lovable and validated and accepted?
That's such a powerful question. And it's also leading you back. I mean, what you're saying about, you know, the 9 years at university and the 15-year career. And what came to me too was that was one form of leading and leadership. And
totally.
Your form of leadership and leading and teaching and shaping people, shaping lives, shaping the world has just changed form. And the latter is no better than where you find yourself now, even if it may be more celebrated by our culture. Because ultimately there's so many people who find themselves maybe where you are or were in your career, who said, my heart's not here anymore. And who need to see a different way. And they need, like, those who hold the light up to that different way. So everything is purposeful, just like the you in the 9-year degrees and or the career was deeply purposeful for the person who was looking up to you and wanting that. And that's where we can just, like, I think, be humbled by the fact that there's room for all of it. Like, you know, whoever you desire to be or break down within yourself, there's room for that. It's about dismantling all of the, all of the space in between that says that can't be.
Yeah, I love that so much. You know, my daughter is going through assessment right now for ADHD, and it's really highlighted the ways that my brain works in really diverse ways. And I think throughout my career, and even when I went through burnout and then started retraining, and looking at life a little differently, or I guess, as you said, like looking at my activism from a place of including more parts of me instead of stripping parts away. There's always been a feeling and an experience in my body of not belonging and being different, and that the way my brain works, the way my body works, just doesn't seem to fit into the normal model, right? But the more I have this conversation and the more that we start to open up spaces of radical compassion, to me, that's where the bandwidth for true activism really comes from, because we're suddenly bringing in all of our beingness into that space of activism or leadership in life, right? Because I don't see activism as just work. It's like we embody leadership, like we are that thing we want to see. And it's been truly liberatory for me to understand that the very things I thought were going to keep me excluded from being loved and being included are the things that are actually my greatest strengths. And one of those is that I course correct when something doesn't feel right. And in a traditional sense, that would be called flaky, that would be called that I'm not resilient, that would be called that I'm a quitter. And if I reframe that according to being in service of life, that's my adaptive potential that has been dialed up, you know. And we know from lots of like studies now that that actually neurodiverse folks and kids, the way they see and think and feel is not defective, right? It is that they cannot tolerate or exist within the systems and the constructs that we've built, and they're simply unwilling to. And so is that something bad, or is that something incredibly resourcing? And could I go to the place where I'm most terrified of not being loved and find within that the thing that's actually my superpower?
Oh, that sounds so liberatory. And doesn't it, I mean, it just flips on this head, this idea even of like this idea of needing to, like, school readiness or like work readiness, or I mean, ultimately it's just trying to ready ourselves for an existing system. Yet what if the very organisms resistant to that system is therefore leading the way to the building of a new system? Like, it's not wrong. It's by design. It's life's design to evolve and transform the systems that we exist in, that we are and that we exist in.
Yeah, totally. I love the way you hear things and then you reflect them back in really beautiful language. It's something I love the most about your activism, actually, is your capacity to synthesize things, and communicate.
But, I mean, thank you. But as you're talking and you're talking about your daughter and thinking so much of what we struggle with as mothers, or even just as humans, and looking at how we've grown and adapted to exist in the systems and ways of being that we come to know and feel safe in, is that part of ourselves is always whispering or pulling us beyond that and saying, this way. That often comes up comes into conflict with everything we've ever known. Yeah. And that's what's happening now.
Yeah. Yes. And can I trust, like, it's the trust thing, right? Can I trust my kid in this path of unschooling? Can I trust her? Can I trust myself to trust her? And trust, if you trace back trust to like when we're little beings, in my family of origin, I was always, which now I understand from a neurodiversity perspective, like very emotional. I was labelled the very emotional one, the careless one, the one that was always in a rush, that like, which makes total sense, right, with the ADHD brain. But I constantly had what I was experiencing in my body not validated, argued against, or punished, right? So what happens if you're saying, I'm feeling this, and someone is, as culture does, continually telling you that's not true, that's not true, that's not true? What we start to do is be like, I can't even trust myself.
Yeah,
because
so we just
yeah, right? Like if I'm feeling this thing, but someone's telling me actually that's not true because it's hitting up against one of their traumas, that trust is eroded continuously. So actually to trust life, it's so beyond like just listening to your intuition, right? It's like trusting life moving through you is a process of starting at the most minimal level, which is like, I'm thirsty, I'm going to get a drink of water. Starting at that most basic level of I trust myself, and I trust my instincts, and I trust my feelings. And I think right now what we're seeing is so many people having so many big feelings with no capacity for anyone to hold them, that we're just turning on ourselves, and that turning on ourselves is then being projected out. We're internalizing that experience we're having in our body is not valid, it shouldn't be there. And there's just so much, if anything, from this conversation, like what you're experiencing is valid. And you don't need to turn on yourself in order to keep yourself safe, you know?
I love that. You don't need to turn on yourself in order to keep yourself safe. And there's so many, I think for many mothers who listen to this who really value conscious parenting as well and holding space for their children, that will certainly have been tested over the last 18 months. But certainly we cannot do that without also practicing what it looks like to hold space for ourselves. And that sometimes one of the hardest things is to how much can you love yourself in your mess, or in your resentment, or in your anger, or in your complete collapse, right? Because so much of us have built our worth and identity on how functional we can be, or how much we can serve or contribute, or I don't know, appreciate others. And what if you have that day or that week where you really can't look after much at all? Are you still okay? And are you still lovable? And where the point at which you say no is where the work is where the integration of those unloved pieces are asking to be nurtured. And it's baby steps, like as you say, it's like those micro movements of, yes, I can love that you just want to not get up off the bed right now, or that you're crying and you don't know why. I can love you in that without needing to know why or to fix it. Much like our children.
It is. It's so revolutionary when I hear your words. I think about what might emerge, you know, because this, make no mistake, this is a generational imprint that we are experiencing in our bodies, in ourselves, in our psyches, in the collective psyche. So let's not pretend it's not, because it is.
Yeah.
And like it's going to change things. I think about what might happen, what might emerge if we were committed and the minimal resources we had were spent there at that edge of comfort, of the places where we're not lovable. Gosh, imagine the parents we would be after that, you know?
Yeah. And I also think too, like, if we take a more macro look at this and we consider, all right, well, if this is life adapting, the world adapting, growing, us evolving, and it therefore is purposeful, then how is it functional? Like in what feels dysfunctional, how is this functional? And, you know, I think that this is the most rapid transformation and growth that we've ever seen in our lifetimes, and possibly since maybe World War II. There wasn't the level of social, cultural, technological, ecological kind of transformation until now, really. And so then when I find myself like getting angry at like the news or at the government or at whatever people, I say to my husband, I'm like, you know, like back in the war, like how far do you reckon it got people to be angry at the government being in the war?
Yeah.
You know, like probably not that far. So knowing that, how can I use my energy in a way to create the life that I want to live, even amid this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because then it's like I'm not leaking my energy or my power and kind of collapsing in the perception that I'm being overpowered. But I'm asking, where is my power?
Yeah.
Where is my freedom? Where is my choice? Where is my agency? Where is my influence?
Where's my capacity? Because it's there. Like we're in this story of like, it's never there, right? It's always so hard. It's always, even in the micro moments of the day when I've got like a little kick up of energy, I'm like, oh, there it is. You know, it's so,
yeah.
It's so amazing what you're saying, because I think that instinct that we have of like someone has power over us, or the perception of the power over thing, right? Which we're experiencing all day, every day, because we live in a colonized capitalist system where power over is the dominant way of being and the dominant way of getting things done. So what we're doing is it's bringing up in us all of those feelings of having someone have power over us. And then we're trying to have power over ourselves for having the emotional response to that. And so we're like, don't get too emotional. Don't get like, just carry on, just hold on, just keep going. Like, just get it together. Just go to the gym more, or just like do more self-care or whatever. Like we're trying to power over ourselves out of it. And then we're having power over other people. So there's this like whole ricocheting, and what our bodies and the earth is saying is like, that's not going to work. That model isn't going to work. So what if we flipped it, and instead of this ricocheting pendulation of power over everywhere, the colonized mindset, what if we started having compassion instead, you know, for ourselves first and foremost, that initial response would be met with just love. I love you. I can see how hard that is. This is right now. I know there's a lot coming up. You're actually healing and repairing, creating reparative experiences for that very first experience of power over, from where all our pain is born, you know, and then that is where we source power within, right? And then that power within gives us capacity to have power with. And we simply cannot do this alone anymore. We cannot live in our industrialized little nuclear family. We just cannot, even though right now it feels impossible to think about community. It's the only place where there's any kind of bandwidth and resilience left.
Well, I mean, that's where we co-regulate, right? So
100%.
The baseline, or, you know, the level at which the family can co-regulate is where the community can take over, right? Like, so we need to be able to plug into the spaces and places that are going to support our own individual and familial kind of co-regulation, and depending on the nervous system development of that particular family, that's going to be a scale. And so it's also the question then kind of leads this discussion to, how do we help co-regulate those who need it more? Like, in what ways do we bring up the survival response in those places where there's great struggle? Without it being the government has to do something, and like us be here in, again, this space of agitation.
Well, I think that this question is like the meeting point of, like, the purpose of my life has been to answer this question, I think, of that place where the work we do within ourselves can transform something in a macro systemic place. And so I'm very aware that as we're recording this, what's happening in Afghanistan is front and centre of everyone's mind. And right now everyone is at capacity, no matter the level of privilege. But it's really important, I guess, I'll stand in my activist place, I'll stand in my embodied place, and then I'll bring them together. It's really important that we have a capacity in our bodies to acknowledge that those at the intersection of identities that have been oppressed throughout the history of colonisation and before are experiencing a million times what we are right now. And that we don't lose anything by just acknowledging that and having grief around that. You know, we don't lose anything by just saying it is like there are folks whose livelihoods, whose families have lost loved ones. They're, you know, in Afghanistan, for example, like very real threats to their life. We don't lose anything by acknowledging it. In fact, as Joanna Macy always says, like the extent to which we feel that grief shows our evolutionary maturity as a global human family, that we feel that pain, that we don't want to stop feeling that pain no matter how much how uncomfortable it is. It makes us human and it connects us to the family of humanity. It connects us into the web of life, right? We can acknowledge that and on the same hand say, I don't have a lot of capacity right now and I want someone to tell me the answer of how to fix Afghanistan because it feels too fucking hard and big. And I don't have a container to even hold my grief, let alone someone else's grief. We can hold both. We can hold both. But the thing is, it's going to be so much easier to hold both if we're holding it together in conversation like you and I are doing now. You know, that you and I are co-regulating each other right now in this grief. We're holding it more like a tripod than just all on me, all on my shoulders. And I think that acknowledging the feedback of the systems we've built don't honour life and don't honour the well-being of all beings and place people in a hierarchy, and that's not life-giving and that's not sustainable and that's not kind, right? And at the same time acknowledging I don't know how to fix it because I'm at capacity. It opens up a tiny space for like questions, really good questions. If I did have a tiny bit of bandwidth today, who could I have a conversation with? What podcast could I listen to? Whose posts can I read on social media? That I can hear the voices of those Afghani women, that I can really understand and pendulate into that grief so that I'm building resilience to hold more of that grief. Because actually, if we really allowed grief to have its full cycle in our body and we wept and we cried and we wailed and we tantrumed, it's the beautiful moment after the ugly cry in the shower. There's resourcing available. There's like creativity. There's connection. There's co-regulation. But we're kind of like, I don't want to even look at it because there's all this other grief piled up. We can't do this without falling apart. We can't do this without showing the ugly, messy, human bit of the composting cycle, the death cycle. So for me, I'm working on a post that at the moment, what can I do about Afghanistan? Number one, strip enough of the things of complexity in your own life away so that there's bandwidth to engage in the conversation and listen to diverse folks' voices. Strip away anything that is there purely because you think it's going to get you loved. Strip away anything that doesn't feel good anymore, and anything that is creating a burden on your taxing on your system to try and live up to a standard that was pre-COVID that is not now. Second thing, start to build community and conversation. Have conversations with people. Be like, I don't know. Be willing to be the exception to the capitalist rule which says you need to be an expert in everything, and say humbly, I don't know. I don't know about this. I haven't heard the voices about this, because all I can hear is the voices of white women like us just calling the irony of it, talking about it, right? Like, I can't hear those voices. Where are those voices? I don't know. I want to learn more.
And being willing to be in that humble place of saying, I don't know, and acknowledging that in not knowing, I may very well screw up, like, or stumble
100%.
or maybe even hurt someone, and to still move forward on that in willingness to understand.
Yeah. And we will fuck up. We just will. And we will get called out. How good is our shame resilience, and how, again, are we meeting ourselves? Are we piling on, or are we being like, oh, I'm learning from that? Like, learning comes from compassion, right? Like, that's where we learn. It's how our kids learn, when they're not having someone standing over them, but standing someone with them, being like, oof, this is hard. And then the third thing is that embodied activism really comes from gifting yourself the medicine first, right? Like, what's happening the way that I grew up in activism was that it was all righteousness and fire, and not a lot of embodiment and compassion, particularly for self. And there's a place for that, you know, like you and I have talked about this before too, right? Like, I love the 20-year-old me that's standing up there with a megaphone, you know, on the back of a ute in the CBD. Like, I love that me. But she wasn't humble, and she wasn't able to be in liminality, and she wasn't into nuance, and she wasn't
everything you're saying is me, you know, like self-righteousness. Gosh, I think at one point I said people shouldn't be allowed to vote if they don't know what they're like voting for. Like, you know, I think I said something like that, you know, and being so sure of yourself, right?
Yeah.
We need those people, but also the maturity, I think, comes in going, fuck, there's just so much I don't know.
Yeah. And the sustainability of it for me, right? So, like, let's call a spade. What's happening in Afghanistan, what's happening globally, what's happening with climate are all examples of power over and toxic capitalism and hierarchy and exclusion and oppression gone haywire, right? Like, just gone to the extreme. So if I want to play the long game here, who am I accountable to? Well, I'm in service of life. I'm accountable to my granddaughters, 5 generations. That's who I'm accountable to. So I might not be able to humbly save every woman in Afghanistan, but what I can do is fundamentally live my life in a way that challenges systems that exclude and oppress others, right? That I can live, and it to the best of my ability, in a messy way, because I still have to exist within the systems.
Yeah.
We're not going to change anything by tweaking the existing. We're talking about radical transformation to come back into connection with ourselves, with the earth, and with others. Radical transformation. That starts here, right? So if I'm accountable to 5 generations from now, it's not to say that it doesn't kill me, and like I don't grieve and cry for the women in Afghanistan right now, and I try to listen, and I try, when I have bandwidth, to do what feels sustainable and what feels aligned with my values, and I try and do it in community, right? All of those things are really important. But I'm also acknowledging that the time frame on this is really long, and we can either look at that and get overwhelmed and do nothing and go into a collapse or a freeze, or we can be willing to have conversations like this, or to listen to conversations like this, or we can be willing to ask really good questions, or we can be willing to challenge the insidious ways that we're being oppressed and oppressing others in our lives with compassion.
Yeah. And as you say, like when you're talking about that generational imprint or impact, to also not demonize power over to the point at which we cannot sound it within ourselves, because whatever we run from, we're going to run into, and whatever we judge, we will breed or attract or become. Like, so there's also that dance of knowing that, yes, my values and my practices and how I want to live my life lead me away from those systems. But I also recognize that millennia of human adaptation means that that's still going to be part of my nervous system for as long as I live, for as long as my children live. Like, you know, it's going to take, we can't just flip to what is this 5D consciousness and be all like loving and accepting and holding of space. It's not going to happen. So part of our growth is loving into the behaviors that we witness that we don't like and that we are that we don't like. Because we don't become this other thing by denying all of these other parts that we make bad. We become that by integrating those and going, oh, okay, I know that I get like that when. I know that other people see me like that. Like, so I am what I witness in the world. And I can pave a new way without going, that's all wrong. Because it's a denial of my humanity to make all of that wrong. But it's about how and where do I want to lead with what I am integrating, what I am visioning.
I love that. I love that nuance. Thank you for bringing that back into that place. It reminds me of there's a lot of talk in the regeneration space of how regeneration differs slightly from environmentalism, right? Like, but I take regeneration more holistically than just environmental stuff. But environmentalism as a activist kind of pathway centers the human as bad and says we're wrong, we're bad, and it's inherently kind of a shame-based, like power over dynamic, right? It's like we did wrong, we're terrible, like blah, blah, blah. But actually regeneration would come from the gift and the lesson and the medicine that we need to create regeneration and support our environment is that humans remember our place in the web of life. But we only remember that when we've walked so far away from it that we're getting that yearning and that instinctive drive back into it. And so regeneration says humans aren't bad or wrong or inherently nasty or evil, right? Humans have a place in the web of life. We just forgot it. We, you know, if you think back to not that long ago, we were stewards. We could support the land and the animals. We could rotate them. We had wisdom that we could work with the land as stewards. Humans have a place. It's almost like when we put humans at the top of that pyramid, we forgot that we have a place, right, to do this, that we're not separate from, we are. And so that what happens when we come from that place that you're talking about, it is radical compassion, because it's saying there was a reason we came here. We had to come here in order to ricochet to a different place, and that can that all be compost too, right? Like, can that all be compost too?
And to not kind of shoehorn your way into a new way of being that says that everything that came before that was shameful.
Yeah. Well, that is actually part of the problem, right? That we're like, oh, don't like that bit, like shaft it off, start again. Like, that's what capitalism does. It's like, don't like that, start again, get a new thing. That thing's broken, get a new thing, right? But actually it's this nuanced path of like, everything belongs, everything is included. And that's the most radical act of compassion.
It really is, isn't it? Because it's like, well, I look at everything that I've been told to cast out and then go, where is its place here?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe I could talk to you all day, but we will need to wrap up this conversation. Is there anything else that you would love to offer our listeners before we step into our quickfire questions?
I think what I really just want to share and, I don't know, invite as we finish up is just a moment of like placing our hand on our hearts and taking a really deep breath and seeing if just for a moment we might be able to feel our feet on the earth or feel our bodies pull of gravity pulling us back, and we might soften our hands, release our grip and our jaw and soften around our hearts and allow just all the milieu of experience to be there without judgment or coercion or expectations. And if we could just feel the beat of our heart and feel the pulse of life within us, and just acknowledge that every single one of us is just doing the absolute best we can, that there's enough torture and pain and grief right now that we just don't also have to turn on ourselves, that this living, breathing pulse of life that's within us, that we are lovable purely because we exist in all of our messiness, in all of our humanity. This living, breathing thing, like we exist, and therefore we are, and therefore it's enough. It's just enough. And if we can practice this embodied experience of sufficiency, my hope is that it inspires creative and courageous and loving action. And whether that comes tomorrow or in a week or in a year, that's enough too. And I just really want to offer just the depth and the well of compassion and just grace for our humanness.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Oh, I feel that. Thank you. So I would love to ask you, Meg, can you recall a time in your life when you experienced immense challenge and turned that wound into wisdom? And can you share with us briefly your experience and that wisdom?
I think it ties into what we're talking about. I had a miscarriage in April, or the end of April this year, start of May. I was 12 weeks pregnant with our third, very wanted, very loved baby, and I found out that the baby had died, and it was this really interesting experience of, it's like when you experience something of that magnitude, the only place that you can go is toward the self. Because you're in so much pain that it's excruciating for you to go to that normal response of piling on and shame and, you know, belittling and like gaslighting. Like the only place that I could move was toward myself. And it allowed two things. The wisdom was twofold. One, everything in my life for a few weeks after that was simplified to the point where there was just pristine presence in relationship and in my family. And it was the most reparative experience to feel enough, because I had given myself the grace because of the depth of trauma that I had been through. Like it took that for me to be like gentle with myself and to release the expectations. It took something so profoundly difficult for me to give myself permission to stop and step back. And I learned from that I don't want to have to go through those things in order to give myself compassion, in order to give myself space and love and slowness and things that we all just desperately yearn for anyway. You know, like could I take the neurons that from that experience and amplify them so that that visceral memory is not just a response to catastrophic grief, but is a response to anything that's like mildly challenging.
It's like when life cracks you open in that way and so rapidly kind of dismantles everything that you thought you had to be.
Yes, that's it. And all of your identity, right, collapses, because in my head I was already a mum of 3. I was, you know, had been working towards that, had been through such a big journey to get there. And so in the one identity crumbling, all of them do, because you can't work. And I have hyperemesis pregnancies too, so I'd been so sick. So much of my identity had already come undone that in that place where there's no sense of who you are left is actually when you find the truth of who you are.
Yeah.
You know?
It's the paradox. God.
The paradox. The other thing, though, is that I had to fall into people, and I've always been able to keep myself safe in relationship. And I fell into the people that I've trained and that I've coached and that were the supports from my business system. Like, it was the first time my business really supported me in that way, in a relational way. And it just made me even more committed to orient my life around connection and relationship, knowing that that is true. Like, I have that embodied experience of that's where resilience comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I know it's a really painful time to share.
Yeah.
The books that you feel everyone should read in their lifetime, or what's been most influential for you, what would you give a woman if you could give her 1 or 2 books?
There's so many.
I know, it's a really hard question.
It's a really hard. I'm just looking at my bookshelf. I think that any of the work around mindful self-compassion, so Kristen Neff's work, even Pema Chodron's work, Thich Nhat Hanh, like any of those books and practices, Tara Brach's practices, like the somatic self-compassion work has been the cornerstone of my business, my activism, my parenting, my everything. And even when I think I've studied it and I've got it, I don't, you know, like, because the wiring to not be compassionate with self is so strong.
Yeah.
That it's like a lifelong practice. And I think I'll keep coming back to those authors and those texts for as long as I live, because they're just, like we've talked about, edges and edges and edges and edges and edges that you will always meet of that's the place where I'm not lovable anymore. Tara Brach says, where did you turn on yourself? And I love that question, like tracing back, like when was the moment I hit that limit and I turned on myself? So, but I'm not so much a reader as a listener and like kinesthetic learner. So, you know, I'm talking about also the practices on their websites and YouTube and stuff. That's how I've embodied it more than reading it.
I love that. And if you could take a billboard, if you could have a billboard anywhere on a superhighway, what would it say?
I'm not very good at like short phrases. It's not my jam. Just say I love you. Just say I love you. I think ultimately the biggest wound, like I'm getting emotional as I talk about it, like the biggest wound, the biggest misunderstanding that we've organised our lives around is that we weren't loved or we're not loved, you know, and so much pain comes from that misunderstanding. So if I can help someone remember that sometime they were a little tiny baby that was cherished and loved and wanted and looked at and gazed at with absolute adoration. Like, if we all could remember that, I just think life would look really different, you know?
I really feel that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Meg. It feels so enriching, and I hope that has been for our listeners too. Where can people find you?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm mostly on Instagram. At Meg J. Berryman, and I have a podcast too called Regenerative Life, and we've just released our tiny course which is called Small is Beautiful, and outlines a lot of the principles that we live our life through, so soil and soul and community and compassion and embodiment, a lot of the things we've talked to today, and we love it. It's a great place to start introduction to this work.
Beautiful. Sounds like a great offering. Thank you, Meg.
Thank you.
Well, to contact me, it's bridgetwood.life. To contact Julie, julietanner.love. You can find us at nourishingyourmother.com.au. Remember to nourish the woman to rock the family, and we'll see you next week when we continue to peel back the layers on your mothering journey. Thank you so much for listening. We literally couldn't do this without you. Please share this podcast with anyone you think it would be medicine for.
If you desire to integrate your learnings practically and supportively into your life, then head on over to bridgetwood.life or julietenner.love to go deeper.
And if you feel like giving back a little to this free content, please rate us on iTunes or Facebook, all of which helps the podcast reach more mamas who need this type of tonic for the soul.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives.
Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavor to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.